There are moments in life when wisdom appears in most unexpected places. A chance meeting, a fleeting conversation, and suddenly the world feels different. Imagine wandering through the hills, lost in thought, when you come across a lone figure, withered by time, yet resilient, unshaken by life's hardships. What if this encounter left you with a lesson you would carry forever? Today, we will be sharing such a moment which William Wordsworth experienced, hidden in a simple but unforgettable meeting. Today, we will read through the lines of resolution and independence, which is also known as the Liege Gatherer. We have covered William Wordsworth's poetry as well as his idea about what is the role and function of a poet, as well as his definition of poetry. He was one of the leading figures of the Romantic movement, and he used to call himself a worshipper of nature. So far as poetry is concerned, he always professed for simple style as well as simplicity in subject matter. His poetry is not just about beautiful landscapes, but about how those beautiful landscapes shape our thought, our emotions. So, although nature is most often the backdrop of Wordsworth's poetry, he is also concerned with man as a part of nature. And in the poem that we're going to cover today, this happens to be the central idea. Now, just like in most of his poems, Wordsworth begins this poem as well with an elaborate description of a natural setting. If you look through the opening lines of this poem, you would realize that he is building up for us a scenery against which he will be foregrounding a human character. So, how does he set up the scene? He writes, "There was a roaring in the wind all night. The rain came heavily and fell in floods." Through this use of alliteration, fell in floods and creation of this majestic ambience, he is telling us about a morning when the night has been quite stormy, but now the sun is rising calm and bright. So in the very beginning, he is showing us that in nature there is this dual aspect. It can be both calming as well as stormy. The birds are singing in the distant woods. Over his own sweet voice, the stock dove broods. The jay makes answer as the magpie chatters, and all the air is filled with pleasant noise of waters. And in his characteristic way, he is mentioning the names of different kinds of birds who are twittering about and filling the air with a kind of soothing beauty. All things that love the sun are out of doors. So it is part of natural instinct that in the daytime, the creatures, they come out and enjoy the day. The sky rejoices in the morning's birth. The grass is bright with raindrops. Now, you would notice that he is using the expression rejoices associated with sky. Sky is, of course, it's first of all an abstract thing. There is no object called sky. But even if you consider it as an object, it is not a living thing. But he is saying that the sky is rejoicing. So how does the sky rejoice? This is, of course, a case of personification where the sky is appearing to be like smiling and celebrating the sunlight because there are no gloomy clouds or rain. Okay. So it's like the morning has taken birth and the sky is rejoicing. The grass is bright with raindrops. On the moors, the hare is running races in her mud, and with her feet, she from the plashy earth raises a mist. So the hare is like a big wild rabbit. So it's running about, playing about, and because of its movements, there's a lot of mist coming out. So everything is gaining a kind of ethereal beauty, as if this is not a muddy place is describing, but a kind of an angelic place. That glittering in the sun runs with her all the way wherever she doth run. I was a traveller then upon the moor. So after the second stanza ends, he gets into the poem literally, saying that I was a traveller then upon the moor. So Here, one more thing is important is that till now, in the first two stanzas, he was using present tense. And then he says, I was a traveler. So you can think of it in this way that when he is describing nature, he is not talking about one single day or a moment which is, gone in the past. Nature is all pervasive and it is omnipresent and it kind of is an immortal presence. So it was there in the past, it is there in the present, and will be there in the future. And so, although he is describing a past incident, he is beginning with present tense in the first two sentences. So, when he comes to his own self, then he goes back to the actual moment when that happened, and that was in the past. I was a traveler then upon the moor. I saw the hare that raced about with joy. So it's like that rabbit still runs around, that morning still comes and rejoices, but he is talking about a specific morning when he saw all those things. I heard the woods and distant waters roar, or heard them not, as happy as a boy. This idea keeps on coming in Wordsworth, that when he was in his boyish days, in his early adolescence, then he used to enjoy nature in a more happy and frivolous manner. And with age, his seriousness has grown, and now he can enjoy nature in a more calm and contemplative way. So he's saying that I heard them not like I would have heard them if I was a very young boy, but I was a mature person then. The pleasant season did my heart employ, but it's not that I was older so I could not enjoy it. I felt the pleasantness. My old remembrances went from me wholly, and all the ways of men so vain and melancholy. Now, the characteristics of growing up is that you get serious about life and you get aware of the hard realities of life. And so he is saying that, yes, I did not enjoy them like a very young child would. I was aware of the vanity of men, the melancholic life of men, but I could still understand the beauty of that scene. But as it sometimes chanceth, so now he is saying that it happens sometimes. Chanceth means happens. From the might of joys in mind that can no further go. So sometimes you get joyful and you reach a certain height, euphoria. So he's saying that sometimes it can happen that you reach that highest point of happiness in your mind, that euphoric state. As high as we have mounted in delight, in our dejection do we sink as low. But the point is, yes, you can feel high when you are delighted, but that means you can also feel very low when that moment of delight goes away. So human life is more about, going from that high point to that low point, and the higher you are capable of going, so far as euphoria, happiness, excitement is concerned, you're capable of going as low. And if you do feel depressed, you feel melancholic, down. So there is an element of inconsistency in human experience. It is not like nature, which is like always filling you with some kind of fulfillment. To me, that morning did it happen so. So he is saying that it is not always that you go from a state of high euphoria to depression as separate emotions. Sometimes it can happen that you feel both of them together. Looking at a scene, we must have felt that ourselves sometimes. It fills you up so much that you don't understand whether you are feeling extremely happy or extremely sad. Sometimes you get emotional, and when you get too emotional, it's difficult to differentiate between the two. So he's saying that to me that morning did it happen so, fears and fancies thick upon me came. So I was affected in a very euphoric manner. At the same time, I had these fears. What was he afraid of? Dim sadness and blind thoughts I knew not, nor could name. The moment you're asking him, what kind of fears were you having? He says, I cannot name them. Sometimes it's very difficult to actually process our emotions and even reach a point where we can say that I've understood what I'm feeling. And he is honest, at least, about saying that I don't know what emotions I was feeling, but I was very, very full. I heard the skylark warbling in the sky, and I bethought me of the playful hare. Now, the point is the skylark, the hare, they are animals and they are actually going about their usual business. Wordsworth is seeing them as playful, and through his own imagination, he is imagining that they are out there enjoying nature. Well, reality could be that the skylark was hardly aware of it. Okay, so it is through Wordsworth's eyes that we rediscover nature. And this is what romanticism is about, adding strangeness to beauty. So these beautiful sights are all around us. It is through the eyes of Wordsworth that they are gaining significance in our eyes. We are being trained to look at nature in a certain way. And he can connect the skylark with the hare, with the rabbit. And then that connection continues. He doesn't just connect the skylark with the hare, but he eventually connects the animals with himself. Even such a happy child of earth am I. So he is claiming his rights to nature. He's claiming that I have as much right to enjoy nature as the skylark has. I am as much part of nature as the rabbit is. And this is where Wordsworth is important, because before him, poets looked at nature in this way, that this is the world of nature and this is the world of man. Wordsworth wanted to bridge the gap and say that world of man doesn't have to be always away from the world of nature. So he is also a child of nature. Even as these blissful creatures do I fare. So I also have emotions similar to these happy creatures about me. Far from the world I walk, and from all care. The only condition is, if you want to really be a part of nature and claim your birthright, you have to be away from civilization, from society. Man is not opposite of nature. Society is opposite of nature. So in order to participate in the natural world, you have to first extricate yourself. Take yourself out from that world of human society, civilization. And this is very much in line with Rousseau and his idea of the noble savage. He said that if you raise a child amidst nature without any external influence, without any rules and regulations and teachings of society, you would raise a noble person who will also be called a savage. So actually the savage is the noblest of creature, because savage means wild, untouched by civilization, and therefore 100% touched by nature. Okay, so this is very much in line with the idea of Rousseau. Far from the world I walk, and from all care. So for him, the world of man or society is the root cause of all care. Care here means concern, anxiety, worry. Okay, so that is also another meaning of care. It is not always the meaning like I care for someone means I love someone. No, care also means anxiety, worry, concerns. Okay, so he is away from human care and human society. But there may come another day to me, solitude, pain of heart, distress, and poverty. But he knows that he has to always return to that zone of human civilization, and then he will come across or come face to face with the worries once again. So his escape from that world of human beings is very temporary. So in that, he is not same as the skylark or the hare. He is different from them. So he is aware of his limitations as a human, that he cannot completely participate in the world of nature. He has to go back to that realm of depression, distress, and poverty. My whole life I have lived in pleasant thought, as if life's business were a summer mood. as if all needful things would come unsought to genial faith, still rich in genial good. So he is basically a very optimistic person, and he feels that all my life I have felt that good things will happen to me. Okay. And I was very casual about life, that everything is fine, everything is well. But how can he expect that others should build for him, sow for him, and at his call love him, who for himself will take no heed at all? Now he is placing a question which is actually in line with something that later on Marxists would ask. That how can you expect people to continue serving you, providing you with things, and you leading a comfortable life? And how can this be an okay situation? And he is showing here traces of discomfort, if not guilt, that it is not right. I'm enjoying life, I'm enjoying its comfort, but others are working. Who are these others? These others are the common people. So, in these lines, he's trying to at least acknowledge the labor of the common man, and he's saying that it doesn't feel right that I should spend a life of casual carelessness while others would be toiling to provide for me. I thought of Chatterton. Now, he is also talking about the poets who had actually sowed the seed of romanticism in England, but they could not, you know, reach that level of accomplishment as Wordsworth, Coleridge, Keats, they did. One of the most important figures in this respect was Chatterton. He actually took his own life, but he was the first one who established these romantic ideas on which the later romantics built upon. And in the beginning, poets like Chatterton, like Burns, they started with a lot of optimism and joy, but they later succumbed to depression, even madness, as was in the case of Chatterton, and they received little financial rewards. So Wordsworth's lines in the previous stanza might also refer to these poets, as if he's saying that others have built for me. Others like Chatterton, others like Burns, they have built for me, and I am getting the reward of their efforts while they had only suffered depression, madness, death. So Chatterton in this case is a symbol of unrewarded genius. I thought of Chatterton, the marvelous boy, the sleepless soul that perished in his pride. It's not that Chatterton was proud. Pride in the sense, you can say a kind of hubris, a kind of refusal to accept any other thing than what you believe in. That is also a sense of pride. Of him who walked in glory and in joy, following his plough among the mountainside. This is Burns, of course. By our own spirits are we deified. So these figures are transformed into gods of poetry. Who has done it? The humans only, the poets only. So he's saying that we have the capability of transforming into gods. And here we detect a lot of egotism where the emphasis is on man and not God. And in Wordsworth, the idea of God is always a very non-Catholic one, and he actually believes that nature is the ultimate source of divine power, and in being able to participate in nature, man obtains his divinity. So it is possible for human beings to become gods, okay? Because the only thing that you have to do is become one with nature. So that kind of a Advaita Vedanta style attitude of pantheism is always there in Wordsworth. He says, we poets in our youth begin in gladness. So just like Chatterton, just like Burns, he himself began with a lot of enthusiasm and optimism. And then there are moments when depression sets in. And its reality is true, because if you are a poet, you are dealing with human emotions all the time. So it's obvious that you are not just getting happy emotions, you're also getting serious concerns about life, mortality, duty. Okay. So it is obvious that if you are a poet, you will get into these dark phases. So he says, we poets in our youth begin in gladness, but thereof come in the end despondency and madness. So it is a very natural progress, I would say, or what? It cannot be called progress in that way, but transformation, shift, transference from joviality, happy mood to serious gloom. Not everybody is like Keats, who kind of manages to be a survivor so far as emotions are concerned, even when he was actually physically dying. Now, whether it were by peculiar grace or leading from above or something given, now something happened. Now, he had already set the mood for us and the setting is done. Now, he is saying that by some divine action, by some stroke of fortune, something happened, befell, a leading from above, as if it was ordained, it was ordered, it was occasioned by some higher force. What has happened? Yet it befell that in this lonely place, he was walking in a very lonely place, looking at animals and birds, when I with these untoward thoughts had striven. So when he was struggling with these gloomy ideas of madness, depression, what happened to Chatterton, what happened to Burns, and he was feeling low, then as if to counter his feeling, nature did something. What? Beside a pool bare to the eye of heaven. Now, eye of heaven is a very common metaphor for sun. We have seen Shakespeare using it. Sometimes too hot, the eye of heaven shines in his sonnets. So, eye of heaven is sun, and he is using this very common metaphor in a very uncommon way. That is his speciality. He is saying eye of heaven, but then he says in the next line, I saw a man. So it is like he is placing his eye as parallel to the eye of heaven. And in that way, a subtle equation is going on. Like I am also an I. Like I am also an EYE. Okay. So I saw a man. The eye of heaven could not see that man because he was in the shade. A man before me unawares. So just by chance I saw a man. The oldest man he seemed that ever wore grey hairs. And it is a general tendency in us to have a kind of reverence for anything that looks very old in nature. If you look at a young tree and then you look at a very old tree, that old tree will generate a sense of awe. Again, a stone which looks very old. Okay, those things have an appeal. Now, this man whom Wordsworth saw there, this man was also extremely old. And old age is associated with what? With wisdom. Here, the old age is also associated with the ability of this man to act as a part of his surrounding nature. And then the comparison directly with a stone is made. As a huge stone is sometimes seen to lie couched on the bald top of an eminence. So sometimes there is a hill, so eminence, and then on the top of it there is a stone. So this man also appeared like that. So that stone on the top of a hill is a natural extension, or you can say it is something very natural to that hill itself. Similarly, this man, amidst that surroundings, appeared to be an integral part of that scene. So here, in this man, nature and man was not separate. And the images that he is using, they are also from the world of nature. He's using the image of the stone, and then later on he'll go to describe the man through some other natural images. Wonder to all who do the same espy by what means it could thither come and whence. And if you look at a stone on the top of a hill, sometimes you might wonder if the stone is that big and old, that how did that stone come there? Who brought it? So that it seems a thing endued with sense, like a sea beast crawleth forth. And sometimes it might appear that the stone on the top of a heath or a hilltop, it has a life of its own, as if it has come on its own, like a sea beast, like Leviathan, that on a shelf of rock or sand reposeth, there to sun itself. It's like that stone has a life of its own, and it has come to that hilltop to sit and bask under the sun, okay, to get a good tan. Now, what is interesting about this simile is that the stone is a lifeless thing. So he is comparing a living thing to a lifeless thing, and then in almost a Miltonic epic simile manner, he is going on talking about that non-living thing, the stone, as if it is a living thing. So what is he doing here? Is he comparing the man to the stone, or is he comparing a stone to the man? That like man, it has the power to move about. So in Wordsworth, you have these strange moments of sublime thought when you actually get very confused that what is he comparing? Is he comparing this with that or that with this? He plays with it, and in a very paradoxical manner. Such seemed this man, not all alive nor dead. So it's like motionless but not lifeless, nor all asleep in his extreme old age. His body was bent double, feet and head coming together in life's pilgrimage. So it's like he had come a long way in his life, and he has bent double. His body is showing his age, as if some dire constraint of pain or rage of sickness felt by him in times long past, a more than human weight upon his frame had cast. So it's like when we move about, we carry our weight, our human weight. But this man is so old, it looks as if he's not just carrying his body weight, he's also carrying the weight of his whole life, where he has suffered sickness, where he has, gone through or endured pain. So it's like he is like a monument, like an entire museum that he is looking at. Himself he propped. So he supported himself, this old man, limbs, body, and pale face upon a long grey staff of shaven wood. So he was holding on to this stick, shaven wood, as a staff or as a support. And still I drew near with gentle pace. So Wordsworth, or the narrator in this case, he goes towards this old man in a very gentle way upon the margin of that Moorish flood. So he was, this old man was standing next to this Moorish flood and this water body, and the poet approaches. Motionless as a cloud, the old man stood. Again, another image where we have the comparison with cloud. So, motionless as cloud. Usually, clouds have motion, they fly about. So, there is a special quality to the cloud that it is motionless when it is compared to the man. That heareth not the loud winds when they call, and moveth all together if it move at all. So, just like the clouds which refuse to move even when there is a wind, this man is refusing to move even when the poet is approaching him. At length himself unsettling, he, the pond, stirred with his staff. So this old man was standing in front of this water body, this pond, and he had this stick with him. So he stirred that water as if he was trying to find something, and fixedly did look upon the muddy water. So when you stir pond water, it becomes muddy, that part, which he cunned as if he had been reading in a book. So he was looking at that muddy, twirling water as if he was studying something like a student studies a book. Now here the comparison is because of the concentration of the man. Okay, he is concentrating on that water just like a reader concentrates on a book. But I told you this is all a series of Miltonic epic similes that we are having. So, what is the additional quality of this similarity? This simile also says that when you read a book, you gain wisdom. Similarly, when this man is looking at nature, he gains wisdom. So, for a common man, for a simple rural person, the source of wisdom is not human learning but natural learning. And this idea of nature as a teacher is very prominent, especially if we look at Wordsworth's Lucy poems. Maybe someday we will have a discussion on them if you want. But there we find that Wordsworth emphasizes the importance of nature as an instructor, as a very, very strict teacher, and even a disciplinarian. So, the kind of knowledge that this man gains from nature is reflected in this imagery or in this simile, where Wordsworth, the poet, is directly comparing his looking at the water with a person's reading a book. And now, a stranger's privilege I took. What is a stranger's privilege? That usually, when you don't know someone and you want to talk to him, usually you begin talking about the weather. It's a hot day. It's a cold day. Right? So he says that I took a stranger's privilege, the usual way strangers talk, and drawing to his side to him did say. So I went on to his side and said, this morning gives us promise of a glorious day. So it's a very good morning. It looks like a glorious morning. A gentle answer did the old man make. So the man responded in a gentle way. In courteous speech which forth he slowly drew. So he spoke in a soft way and slow way. And him with further words I thus bespake. I spoke to him. What occupation do you dare pursue? What are you doing here? What job are you doing here? This is a lonesome place for one like you. It's a lonely place. You are an old man. Why are you here all by yourself? And before he replied, a flash of mild surprise broke from the sable orbs of his yet vivid eyes. So his eyes are compared to orbs, which is again a very common comparison to planets, to spheres. So he's looking at the poet as if he's surprised. And why is he surprised? What does he say? His words came feebly. Now it's an old man. His voice is also weak with age, from a feeble chest. So you see this man, who is apparently the center of this poem, is not a very heroic, dashing figure. So the idea of central character in a poem has also shifted in Wordsworth. In Wordsworth, we have celebration of not just nature, but also the common people. And he is placing here a very old man, a frail man, in front of him as somebody who he actually glorifies. But each in solemn order followed each. So his words were not jumbled up. They were not like, this is again a kind of throwback at the madness of Chatterton, of the wise people whose words jumble up. This man's words were clear, although weak, with something of a lofty utterance dressed. So in the clarity of the words, there was an element of seriousness, loftiness, height. Choice word, measured phrase. So there was no roundabout way of talking, and this is what Wordsworth really admired, that you will speak straight to the point, and that is what he admired in the common men, especially of the rural areas, that they spoke their minds openly without twisting their words. And he says that choice words and measured phrase above the reach of ordinary men. And this was not possible in a man who grew up in an artificial environment. Only nature could provide you with that clarity. And what did that man say? A stately speech. Now, what is our idea of a stately speech? Something that Martin Luther King gave, or something that Vivekananda gave in Chicago, right? That is our idea of stately speech. So let's look at what Wordsworth's idea of stately speech is. Such as grave livers do in Scotland use, religious men who give to God and man their dues. So the kind of high sounding speeches that are usually delivered by religious leaders, compared to that, this man is different and at the same time higher. So the speech that he heard from that old man was as dignified as that of a Presbyterian of Scotland, while performing their duty towards God and man. Church leaders, they used to have these very lofty speeches. So what did this old man say that makes the poet feel this way, that he gave a high speech? He told that to these waters he had come to gather leeches. Leeches. Why would he gather leech in the first place? Now, leech gathering, uh, it was a already declining profession. Okay. And first of all, why were leeches required? For many purposes. Back in those days, leeches were used in medical procedures, and people were required to collect these leeches physically. And leeches are like these, you know what leeches are? It's like blood drawing, wormy, small little snake like creatures. And when they stick to your skin, they draw blood and they get swollen. And if a lot of leeches attack you, the blood loss might be even fatal. So it is not a profession that is very rewarding. It is risky. You need to be very, very careful of your whereabouts, first of all. Second is, it is very important for you to know where you can find a lot of leeches. So you need to understand the ways of nature. You have to be very, very trained in those aspects to be able to locate that this is the zone. Usually leeches are found in wet, warmish, watery places, marshy places. And those places are also filled with other things like snakes and scorpions. So these are not very habitable places, but these leech gatherers go there because of their demands of profession. So he says that I have come here to gather leeches. Being old and poor, employment hazardous and wearisome. It's a very tiring profession, You have to, and that is why he has bent in this way. All his life he has been gathering leeches, and in order to gather them, you cannot just fish them with a net or something. You have to actually pick them up physically. So you have to stoop down all day, and all his life he has been doing this. So his body has actually become bent because of his work. And he had many hardships to endure. From pond to pond, he roamed from moor to moor. Because if he gets a lot of leeches in a particular place, it's not that the next day he's going to get some more there. He has to go to some other pond, some other moor, some other marshy land. Housing with God's good help by choice or chance. So he doesn't know where he's going to spend his night because he has to move around so much in search of leeches. And in this way, he gained an honest maintenance. This is how he has managed to live, survive so far. This has been his profession. The old man still stood talking by my side, but now his voice to me was like a stream scarce heard. So till now he was hearing, I was listening to this old man. And then he gets into this zone of fantasy and daydreaming, what romantic poets do so well. So now he begins to think or add his own ideas to it. That till now I was listening, now his voice appeared to be like a stream, lulling him to a kind of subconscious zone. Nor word from word could I divide. So he was kind of awake but asleep at the same time. Okay. And the whole body of the man did seem like one whom I had met with in a dream. So maybe in some past dream. So we are looking at an incident in the past, this whole encounter. And he's saying that standing there, I was reminded of something that had happened to me before that. So it is more past. Okay. And there is kind of a connection with the mist in the first stanza. In the first stanza, you have that word mist. So here he is like taken to that mist. So that natural environment in which the rabbit's movement was stirring up the earth, which was like transforming something real into something fantastic, right? Into something like a dream, like an angelic space. Same thing is happening here. This man is talking to him, and this natural scene transformed into something supernatural. And he remembers some man whom he had seen in a dream. Or like a man from some far region sent to me to give me human strength by apt admonishment. It's as if this man, old man, was not a real human being. This was like an admonishment. It's like nature was telling the poet that you get depressed so easily. You get down so easily. Look at this man. He's actually physically, literally bending down because of his profession. Because of his old age, he has suffered so much. And still, he has come up in this morning to collect leeches, and you are complaining of your life. So, this is how nature teaches him, admonishes him. So, he feels that this is not a man, this is a teaching from nature. So, that man transforms into, you can say, like the tablet of Moses, like a commandment. My former thoughts returned, the fear that kills. He was talking about feeling afraid earlier, and hope that is unwilling to be fed, cold, pain, and labor, and all fleshly ills, and mighty poets in their misery dead. I was thinking about Chatterton, that he had died, he was a mighty poet, perplexed and longing to be comforted. So he was confused that I was thinking about depression, about the way we all pass from joyful enthusiasm to this gloomy mood, depression, and then sometimes we, quote death. And then he got confused that like, he wanted to be comforted, to be given assurance that what was reality after all, what he should do. My question eagerly did I renew. So I questioned that man. How is it that you live? And what is it you do? He's still not convinced that this man is getting up every day and is looking practically okay with it. How can he be okay with it? With something like this. He with a smile. So he was still capable of smiling. He with a smile did then his words repeat and said that, gathering leeches, far and wide he travelled, stirring thus about his feet the waters of the pools where they abide. So he was talking to the poet and he spoke about the places he had been, and he says, once I could meet with them on every side, but they have dwindled long by slow decay, yet still I persevere and find them where I may. So the leeches have kind of been exhausted, finished. That's why he has to move around from one place to another. He says that earlier I used to find more leeches. Leeches are not surviving, but I am still surviving. So he finds it very funny. So they have dwindled long by slow decay. They have decayed, getting extinct. I am a survivor. While he was talking thus, the lonely place, the old man's shape and speech all troubled me. Why was the poet so troubled by his words? In my mind's eye, I seemed to see him pace about the weary moors continually. He could imagine that this man will be getting up again tomorrow, again he will come to this place or some other place, gathering leeches, wandering about alone and silently, while I, these thoughts within myself pursued, he, having made a pause, the same discourse renewed. So while he was thinking about all these things, that this man will be again getting up tomorrow, again coming for the leeches, what is it all about? Then that man, he started again. And soon with this he, other matter blended. And that man started to talk about something else. Cheerfully uttered, with demeanor kind. So, with his kind expression, with his genial spirit, he conversed with the poet. But stately in the main. His attitude was very stately, very respectful, and in fact noble. Okay, the idea of noble savage again. And when he ended, I could have laughed myself to scorn to find in that decrepit man so firm a mind. So he understood after that conversation ended that this man is able to withstand so much suffering. Compared to that, what have I suffered? Nothing. So here we can say that he gets a kind of a resolution. What resolution? That you can have a firm mind even after such a suffering or life full of suffering. Then why should you give way to depression, give way to despondency so easily? God, said I, be my help and stay secure. I'll think of the leech gatherer on the lonely moor. So this image of this man gathering leeches on the moor will be for him a symbol of resilience, a symbol of refusing to give in. Okay. And why is he giving the word independence in the title? Because this resolution, this solving of the life's puzzle gives him a kind of independence, independence from sorrow. And at the same time, this man represents a kind of independence, this old man, which helps him gain the resolution. So resolution and independence, they are interconnected. And they are both present in the figure of this leech gatherer. So this poem is also alternatively titled as The Leech Gatherer. Okay. Now, so far as the occasion of the poem is concerned, it's found in Dorothy Wordsworth's journal, and she writes about this incident that Wordsworth probably met the leech gatherer on September 28, 1800 on the road to Grasmere, and it was in some place above the Dove Cottage where the brother and sister met. And she writes this: an old man almost double. So he was bending low. He was almost double and he was carrying a bundle. He wore an apron. I'm reading from Dorothy. He wore an apron and a nightcap. His face was interesting. He had dark eyes and a long nose. This man had been in the army. So brother and sister Dorothy and William Wordsworth, they met this man carrying this huge burden. 9 out of 10 children and his wife were dead. And his trade was to gather leeches. And now leeches were scarce. And he didn't have the strength for it. He lived by begging. And so this is the usual occasion on which the poem is built. Again, there is this letter written by Wordsworth to some friends where he talks about his feelings connected to this poem. And I want you to hear this. I will explain to you, this is what Wordsworth is writing in his letter, in prose, my feelings in writing the poem. So he actually writes to his friend about this poem. So we will get a lot of explanation here. I describe myself as having been exalted to the highest pitch of delight. So he says that I am, always I feel like nature takes me to this highest moments of joy. Okay, this is what he writes. And then he says, a young poet in the midst of happiness of nature is described as, so when a young poet is very happy in nature, then what happens to him? Is overwhelmed by the thoughts of the miserable reverses. So they can also experience the opposite, like we were seeing in this poem itself. I think of this till I am so deeply impressed with it. So he thinks about it in this way. A person reading the poem with feelings like mine, so he was confused between joy and sadness. And then if you are in that same state and you're reading the poem, what will you feel? Will have been awed and controlled, expecting something spiritual or supernatural. What is brought forward? So we were expecting him to narrate to us something supernatural with all the backdrop and everything, right? Then what does he actually do? A lonely place, a pond by which an old man was the figure presented in the naked simplicity possible. Instead of presenting a supernatural scene, I presented in the poem a very natural scene. The feeling of spirituality, this is important, note it, or supernaturalness is again referred to as being strong in my mind in this passage. There was something supernatural. There was something beyond natural. Where was it? In my mind. In the way I was looking at the old man, right? As a rock, as a cloud. The old man was natural. I then describe him. Whether ill or well is not for me to judge. I don't know if the poem is good or not. With perfect confidence. I have described the man with perfect confidence. But this I can confidently affirm that though I believe God has given the imagination, God has given me that sight, to look at this man as a symbol of resilience, of strength, of nobility. I cannot conceive a figure more impressive than that of an old man like this. So this is the sum total of my imagination. So on one hand, we can say that this man was what? Imagined by him? Or was he really there and he imagined that nobility about him? We don't know. Whatever it is, his imagination is always connected to nature. This is what he's saying. And even when he's talking about men, he's talking about men who are working in tune with nature. And then he finally writes, it is in the character of the old man to tell his story, which an impatient reader must feel tedious. Sometimes, old men, they tell you stories, and if you are a young person, you might feel bored. But good heavens, such a figure, in such a place, a pious, self-respecting, miserably infirm and pleased old man telling such a tale. But when you place that old man in that surroundings, then his story becomes more attractive. So then we can say that this is again a case of double dependency, where nature is gaining something out of the old man. The old man is providing the setting a kind of focus, because he was describing in a vague way and then he sticks to this figure of this person. So this old man is giving this natural surroundings a kind of meaning. And at the same time, the natural surroundings, they are providing the old man with significance. So if you take the old man out of this background, he becomes just an old man with a boring story. Similarly, if you take the old man away from this natural scene, this natural scene loses its human value. So nature and man are working together in creating this space of significance. All right. And this interdependence of nature and man is something that is celebrated repeatedly in the poems of Wordsworth. So the transforming power of imagination, the way he is changing the old man into some figure of Messiah-like inspiration, is because that old man is in the laps of nature. The feeling that the poet has towards the old man is not of pity, but of respect. Why? Because this man represents both resolution and independence, and he is capable of generating those emotions in the poet. He does mention that it is God's help, so we can say there is a kind of a reference to a possibly Christian God here, but still the overpowering presence of nature is undeniable. Okay? Some might feel that the poem is all about the glorification of Wordsworth's imagination. He's saying that I imagined this whole thing and all. But then it is also about the fact that there's a realization. And what is that realization? That if you do not face and confront life's struggles, if you want to escape from them, then you can never be completely free. This is also important because usually we associate romanticism with escapism, and we say that romantic poets were escapists. This is one of the few instances where we can say that a romantic poet is not talking about escaping life, but about facing its challenges head on, just like the leech gatherer has done all his life. And that resolution would give him the kind of independence he really needs in his life. This poem is often prescribed for service commission exams and even for UPSC, if I'm not wrong. So I hope this session has been useful for you. If you are preparing long questions, you should focus on how the figure of the leech gatherer is described and presented. Second is you have to talk about the way in which nature is presented in this poem. In both these cases, you have to talk about the interdependence of man and nature, how natural images bring out the supernaturality of the man, and the man's presence brings out the grace of nature. So, how both of these ideas are actually interconnected. And then the justification of title is there, especially if the title that you are prescribed is resolution and independence. You have to show how the poet passes from confusion, perplexity, to a sense of determination, and what wisdom he gains from the leech gatherer. So, all these things, if you might be asked questions on poetic diction, in that case, we can talk about the simple style of Wordsworth. Although he uses certain archaic words, certain complicated syntax, but at least his subject matter is simple, and his main characters, the central character of his poetry, is a man who is not at all a sophisticated person. So, in all these, he is true to his prescription, as he says in the lyrical ballads, the preface to the lyrical ballads, that poetry is about man speaking to men. And he is talking about emotions and experiences, not of city life or urban scapes, but about universal emotions that are felt across generations, across society, across class. And the tone of the poem is contemplative, and at the same time, there is an assertion at the end, a confidence at the end, and the tone shifts towards a more self confident one, which is characteristic of Wordsworth. It's like the leech gatherer is gathering his confidence as a leech also and raising it up, and it's getting extinct day by day, but he still manages to get back on track of optimism. Wordsworth is not always liked by a lot of people, but if you have managed to like his words here, do drop in your comments. And if you haven't liked this poem, well, I haven't written it, so you are not to blame me for it. But if you have liked my explanation, I would be glad to know about it too. Do let me know of any other poem that you want me to cover. So, till we meet again in some video very soon, this is Monami Mukherjee signing off. Bye bye.